Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Nii Ayikwei Parkes, and I was the lead judge for the Commonwealth Prize in 2020, for which the winner of the Commonwealth Short Story Prize was Kritika, who is sitting opposite me now. We're about to have a conversation. How are you, Kritika?
I'm very good. Thank you, Nii. How are you?
I'm very well. I thought that just so that people get a sense of why we're here and the extraordinary story that brought you the winner's medal or jug or whatever you want to call it, it would be great if you just read an excerpt from your winning story, The Great Indian Tea and Snakes.
The girl with the black bindi knows that she's not supposed to glance at the boy in the white skull cap, but she does. The boy moves restlessly on a stool as he cradles a cup of chai in his hands. The girl has flavored it with cardamom for no extra cost before swallowing the leftover pod so her father won't find out. He's the mustachioed owner who cleans his ears with Q-tips at the cash counter. The girl looks up from the boiling contents of the saucepan, pretending to notice new customers while examining the contours of the boy's stubbly chin, the kite-shaped birthmark on his neck. He mostly watches the speeding vehicles on the road. Once in a while, he meets her gaze and his ears turn crimson. At such moments, the girl and the boy realize that they must immediately look away, but never stop noticing each other wherever they go. It is September. Hawkers appear with baskets of tomatoes. They are overpriced but surprisingly red. The girl's father asks her to buy 2 kilos. They would keep tomato chutney on the menu until tomatoes become wholly unaffordable in the winter. She squats at the water pump outside the store to wash the tomatoes, facing the boy, gazing at the stubbed toe sticking out of his sandals. He's one of the few customers who prefer eating keema samosas to aloo samosas, but it is the least of the girl's concerns. Their stuffings are somewhat different, but the girl makes both types of samosas with the exact same batter. They are the same thing unless one absolutely wants to differentiate, which most people do, including the girl's father, who has strictly warned her against eating keema samosas. A chilly breeze leaves the girl covered in goosebumps. Why does it have to get cold? She says to no one in particular. Seasons change, says one of the men sitting next to the boy. They are daily wage laborers who ask for aloo samosas with their chai, not keema samosas, never keema samosas. They carry grimy shovels and miss no opportunity to talk. Because this is how it is. Because this is how it's always been. Because the earth moves around the sun, says the boy. The girl breathlessly punctures the tomato, then washes the red mush off her fingernails. She has never heard him speak before.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think, it brings back all the things that were really fascinating and rewarding about the story. There's so much symbolism in there. And now I think of it again, and I think of the cardamom pod as a tongue that you have to hold when you grow up in a place like this, that you want to say something, but you can't say it. And so you swallow it. There's every time I read or hear the story, there's more symbolism that comes up. And I think, with my fellow judges, it was a thing that was fascinating. Outside of the beautiful language, the drawing of the environment, the seasonality, everything is alive in there. And in addition, there is this. So, I guess the main question is, it's now been a year since you won the prize. The new shortlist has been announced. How have things changed for you? What is your relationship with writing now compared to what it was when we last spoke? When actually I delivered news that had us both almost in tears.
Yeah.
When you won.
I remember that. Things have changed a great deal. And never in my life before during the span of 1 year, so much has changed about my writing career. I signed with an agent who was like one of my dream agents. And so like just signing with him and knowing that he shares my vision as a writer and he would do his best to get my work out there is a very, very good feeling. And I'm still finishing my first novel, which I was before the short story prize announcement as well. But now I feel like there are people waiting out there wanting to read what I have to write. And it just makes me feel like a lot less invisible. Like, of course, I'm sitting alone all by myself doing my thing. But I feel like, oh, but there's an audience out there and I'm not just speaking into the void anymore. I also feel like I have a lot more confidence in myself as a writer, which is something that's difficult, I think, for any writer. But I would say for women and non-binary people more so. And I struggled with self-doubt a lot. And I continue to actually, I don't think it's ever going to fully go away. But I do feel like every now and then when I have like a major episode of self-doubt, I tell myself that there's no point, like being extremely negative, or I don't catastrophize anymore. Like I feel like I can take a few steps back and then come back to it with like a renewed spirit. And that's good. It feels like that's something that I could keep doing for the rest of my life. Like it's a self-sustaining kind of a situation now. Also, like my family, like they think that I'm doing something worthwhile, which has always been so important to me because I'm an Indian kid. And I mean, I guess everybody knows a little bit about how the relationship between Indian children and Indian parents are, that we are always trying to make them proud. And they always look at external validation to know that their children are actually doing something worthwhile. So that's been good. I have sort of signed with some people who are doing some really exciting projects. Like this one person is trying to reimagine Virginia Woolf's Orlando in the context of post-colonial India and wants to produce this for like a dance performance. And I'm like part of like the project. I'm doing some part of the writing. And so I've never done anything like this before. Just to be approached by them and know that they think I can pull this off is quite a nice feeling. So yeah.
Okay. So it's almost as though the win has given you a little veneer of resilience in the moments of self-doubt. And a bit of a sprinkle of validation, the gold dust or the magic dust of validation to kind of hold the family at bay a little bit, which is great. But I suppose also one of the things that happens with this, and you talked about now feeling like there's an audience out there, is this double-edged sword of now being able to say I'm a writer, but then now people feeling emboldened to ask you, what are you working on? How is it coming? So there's a kind of pressure that comes with that as well, right? Whereas before it's in secret, and so you can just kind of work at your own pace. And so I don't know, does that feel like extra pressure to finish quicker, or are you just taking it in your stride?
Yes, it does. You're right that it's a double-edged sword. And this whole, I think one of the things that can be detrimental to producing good writing is taking yourself too seriously as a writer or a person. And I think that goes for any artist or any person doing anything, really. But what really helps me, and I realized this like soon after the short story prize announcement, is that there are people in my family, and I'm very close to my family, there are people in my family who really don't care much about this stuff. And for instance, like my 17, 18-year-old brother, I don't think he's really read the short story. And I don't think he's going to. And I like that, because when I talk to him, he doesn't talk to me as a writer or the winner of the 2020 Commonwealth Short Story Prize. He just talks to me as his elder sister, and doesn't pay attention to most of the things that I have to say. And so I feel like that is very grounding. It's very grounding, because he helped me remember what it's like to just be a person and not have any of these labels attached to your name.
It reminds me of I was watching an interview with a writer in America called Sister Soldier, who was also a hip hop artist and stuff like that. And she was talking about how her nieces have no respect for her legacy. And you know, that's what keeps her anchored and grounded and connected with the world and stuff like that. But outside of your brother, are there things that you do not to take yourself too seriously? You know, do you, in the middle of the paragraph, jump up and start dancing or anything like that?
I do sometimes when I'm all by myself, will start dancing, but that'll only happen if like there's already like Bollywood music playing, which is something that I do to not take myself seriously. And I think that I've listened to a few interviews by writers, and they always mention like really like high art kind of music. But I feel like when I tell people that I listen to Bollywood music and Shah Rukh Khan is so important in my life, I feel like I would come across as less literary, but I have grown up to a point where I realized that that's not a good consideration to hold on to. To constantly be thinking, am I being too literary? You know, so I bring that to my writing too. When I listen to these songs that have such a mass appeal, I am reminded that that's the kind of writing I want to produce, that I want to keep the complexity intact while making my work accessible to the masses. I was a very nerdy kid, and I was studying all the time. And there was a tiny store across from our house, where this young man would play really loud Bollywood music and wouldn't let me study. And so I used to get so frazzled, and I used to just constantly be telling my mom to tell him, because like I didn't even want to talk to him. I didn't want to have anything to do with this person who played such loud music. And I obviously, like at that time, had this impression that I don't, this is not good music. I should listen to Leonard Cohen and all of that kind of stuff. And so my mom would tell him to lower the music, the volume. And then, so that's the thing, like now I play really loud music when I'm writing, because I want to recreate that environment in which I grew up, because that's where my writing is set. I want to remember what it was like to be growing up on a noisy Indian street with all of these sounds and all of these languages.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful. I mean, and it also kind of leads me into the other question which I wanted to ask about your writing, because what happens in the short story that won, but also in some of the other works that I've read, is you're a great advocate for the kind of silenced voices of it. I mean, India is a very, very complex place. You know, I remember traveling there in 2006, maybe, with a group of other people working in publishing from England. And we would go around. So we were in Delhi, we were in Jaipur, we were in Calcutta, and we would go around, and people would go and they'd say things to people or ask for things. And then people would nod, and they would be certain that they'd been heard. But having grown up in a place like Ghana, where, you know, the English language is a familiar sound, we will nod, but it doesn't mean that we've understood. I would always say to them, there's no guarantee you've been understood here. So don't start complaining about the service later on, because I'm telling you, that person hasn't heard you. And they just could not compute, because in the English imagination, I mean, in the mainstream, they believe that India speaks English, right? Because, I mean, it was a British colony. And so sometimes all that complexity can escape people. And I love that, I mean, there's a line in one of your stories, I think 31 Things About the Line of Control, where you talk about at some point being a fish that didn't know the water in which it swam, or something like that. It's a really beautiful line. I'm sure I've completely massacred it, but but that's the import of it. And I feel like in your work, now that you have begun to know the water, you're very dedicated to making that water known to the world. Is that part of the project, and what is your approach to it? Is it a political approach? Is it just an approach that wants to flesh out the full possibilities, humanity, histories of India?
Yeah, when I get this question, I always think about Neil deGrasse Tyson, who was this astrophysicist who said that the first time we went to the moon was not when we discovered the moon per se. It's when we for the first time we turned around and saw the Earth as this pale blue dot in the middle of nowhere. And that picture really became significant in helping conversations around climate change and a sort of unity of like humanity and creatures across geopolitical borders. And so I think something similar happened to me when I left India. I didn't realize that, I didn't anticipate this was going to happen. But as soon as I left, I realized that I'm looking back at what I'd left behind and with like a whole new perspective. So I was immediately missing all the languages that I was only listening to English and Spanish for the most part. And I was missing all of the other languages that I used to listen to on a daily basis without understanding them. And all the kind of complex class divisions and caste divisions that exist in Indian society that go completely unnoticed in like the public imagination of the rest of the world. I was challenged with like trying to explain what home is for me when I was talking to people outside. And that's one of the reasons I am very dedicated to crafting stories and essays where I bring this out alive, because I made friends with people from around the world and I have this deep need for communication, and I want to show them, this is what it looks like where I am from. And so, yes, growing up in a place like Jharkhand, which is one of those places in India where it's a very mineral-rich area and primarily populated by indigenous people who are called the Adivasis. And growing up in Jharkhand, I think my engagement with the Adivasis was always informed by a certain power dynamic. And when I left and I started reading up about the struggles of the indigenous people of India, I realized how much of their history had been deliberately kept away from me. So that's just one example of how I realized that growing up in India, you can still be very insulated from what's really happening in the villages in the same state that you're from, and how like you went to this college, but did you know that the land on which your college was built was actually illegally taken away from people who are not rehabilitated? So those kinds of issues started becoming very important to me after I left college and moved away from India. And I became very interested and invested in them because I also realized there's very few people talking about those kinds of things from in and around Jharkhand. And I realized that there is the need for somebody to speak up. And I think that there's always going to be mistakes that anybody would make, especially when people are trying to talk about divisions that they are not necessarily at the receiving end of. But I also think that being preoccupied with potential mistakes is a Western-centric, individualistic kind of an approach where you're always concerned with your own status and your own legacy as a writer, and not necessarily thinking in terms of contributing to the collective goal. So yeah, those are the kinds of things that became really important to me. And I get this question also where people are like, why must you write about India? Like, why don't you just write sci-fi? And I think that I think people should be able to write what they want to write. Like, I feel like sci-fi is so much like white men from the United States are effortlessly producing like sci-fi fiction, and nobody says anything like, why don't you write about war, write about insurgency and immigration? Nobody tells them any of this stuff. So I do have a lot of sympathy for my contemporaries who are burdened with having to write about issues that I'm naturally interested in.
Yeah. It's one of those things, I guess, which is, it's the whole blessing and curse thing, isn't it? Because without tension, there is no story, right? If you don't have adversity, then what are you describing?
Yeah.
Sort of thing. It's all you kind of need to have the tension in order for something to be memorable.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's really interesting. And also out of these threads, I guess, come stories that are actually sometimes more fantastic than science fiction.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the thing about Gabriel Garcia Marquez saying that, he doesn't consider what he writes,
Yeah.
Magical
realism.
Magical realism, because that's literally it's happening right there. Yeah. So I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, the trick then is, and it's a balancing act. And I think that I can already see in your writing that you have that capacity. It's to talk about these things without them weighing down the writing, right? And I think that's something that you're doing already. And I'm curious to know how that's feeling within the novel, because you're clearly adept at doing it within the short story. The novel is a slightly larger beast. How are you wrestling with that? What can you tell us of what you're working with in the novel? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely social justice issues, to put it simply, are important in the novel too. And I have, again, once again, sort of, it's a young person's point of view. There's two young people who are at the center of the novel. And I keep going back to something Zadie Smith said in one of her essays, where she said, you should write without fear. Write without fear. And when you're writing a person with XYZ characteristics, don't try to pigeonhole them into what this person is perceived to be as.
Right.
Try to imagine the most impossible thing that this person could do, and then sort of pursue it and see where it takes you. And that's really been helping me, because I feel like just because two little girls are growing up in a post-colonial context doesn't necessarily mean that they have all the vocabulary and the jargon to speak back to the empire. And they don't even have to do it at that stage. But I could still, as the writer that I am, I could still communicate some of that tension while keeping their innocence intact. And so I am really liking the young person's perspective that I'm writing from right now, because it allows me to not be pedagogic, not be very formulaic in my approach to discussing any of these important issues. I can bring in humor, I can bring in sarcasm, which is not even intended. And there's the possibility of playing with multiple layers that are not necessarily acknowledged by the protagonists and the characters, but can still be evident on the page for the reader.
Right. And I think there's also something that is sometimes more powerful when the vocabulary doesn't exist, because to some degree, unease comes before vocabulary, right? Mm-hmm. Something is wrong before you have the words for it sometimes.
Yeah.
And sometimes depicting that unease allows, and we have to remember that reading is a collaborative process. Writing and reading are collaborative. So it allows a space for your reader to connect with that unease and give it vocabulary themselves. Mm-hmm. And that vocabulary, the beauty about it happening in the reader's head is that vocabulary can come in any language, even though they're reading you in English. Yeah. Because in the same way that if I'm reaching for a word to describe something and it doesn't come to me in English, I will reach for any of the other languages I speak to describe it to myself. Just having the tension of the unease over there allows us to then reach within our own wider well of possibilities. I mean, way more than one writer can conjure, to give emotion to what we're reading. And I believe this is how novels breathe, right? This is how they grow larger than whatever you can create on the page. It's this interaction between the reader and the writer, which is again why when I was telling you about your win, I was eulogizing about the layers within it, because those are the things. It's almost like when we talk about pastry, you know, you have puff pastry. You know, when you have the layers, it can puff more, right? And that's almost like the vision I see when a work is layered. And so I'm very attached to the idea of putting layers within work. And so one of the things I love about your writing, and I'm really keen to see how that comes across in the novel. And I mean, I know it's not easy, and I'm not putting pressure on you. I'm just saying that I'm keen to see what comes out. I'm curious because I know that you're currently on a residency. So I'm curious about, I don't necessarily have a writing process when I'm within my normal element. If I go on a residency, I try to create one. Are you finding that you're in a new rhythm within this space?
I do think that, so I don't consider myself to be somebody who's very comfortable with packing up and leaving and living somewhere for 3 months and just coming back. Like, I need a lot of time to get used to a place and to get used to like the grocery store and like all of that kind of stuff. And I get disoriented very quickly. I get lost very quickly. So those were my initial challenges when I got here. But then I quickly kind of fell in love with the beauty of New Mexico, which is where this residency is. And it's a very beautiful, quiet location. And I feel grateful to have the chance to live here, because like most of the people who live here are like very bougie, you know, they can afford these very fancy houses. And I feel like I got this opportunity based on my writing sample or whatever. So I feel like I'm very grateful. And I have a nice view from my writing desk, which overlooks a dirt path, which I was thinking is kind of like a great metaphor for narrative, because a dirt path is not always accessible. You know, for the longest time when I got here, the snow and the melting snow just made it very difficult to walk on that path. And so you have to wait for it to be accessible, for it to allow you to be there, exist there. And so I've been loving all of that. The birds are very beautiful here. The solitude, again, like I considered myself to be somebody who's adept at dealing with solitude and wants to be alone all the time. But the pandemic, I think, as for most people, has made me realize new things about myself, in that I do like knowing at the back of my head that I can make plans if I wanted to. And when that is taken away from me, I freak out. And so that's been a new revelation for me after coming here.
This dirt path, I want to ask, where does it lead?
Dead end.
Okay.
It's a dead end. I mean, on one end, it can actually lead you to the town, but what I'm looking at is a dead end, which actually reminds me of what Ingrid Persod said in her interview. She said, I think I'm going to be writing the same novel over and over again. I'm writing the same book all over and over again. And I that's beautiful. I love dead ends, I have to say. And I always feel like I'll always go into dead ends whenever I see them. And I hope that people are not watching, because they'd be like, why is she going towards a dead end? But you know, that allows a lot of possibility for introspection. And I like how unkempt and kind of unself-conscious dead ends can be, you know, because no one's really expecting you to be there.
I love this idea of writing the same story over and over again. But also in what you've told me, I get the sense that there are so many stories to tell. Yeah. So the same story over and over again might mean that it's the same spirit that fuels those stories, but then the stories move. I mean, one of the things I find confounding is when I meet people who say, I've run out of stories to tell.
Right.
Because I don't believe, at least from my reality, and certainly from a few friends that I know from Latin America, from the Indian subcontinent, etc., that they will ever run out of stories to tell. Because I can think of just a week of my childhood and I'll have so many stories to tell, like completely crazy stories. And then, you know, one of the things we're seeing now from India, and we have a mutual friend, Aruni Kashyap, who, you know, writes about Assam quite a bit. And one of the things that we're finding from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, is that people are writing from some of these smaller, you know, regions, and that is a whole new boom. And then there's also been a history of writing in other languages that we haven't even finished exploring in translation. And so I just feel like if we just think about the stories that animate somebody's history or heritage alone, there's so much there, let alone the possibilities of the future, and even in the present with so many people and so many, you know, things happening. So I guess you're feeling confident about your storytelling into the future.
I mean, sometimes confident, sometimes I still struggle with self-doubt, but I really like what you said about the layers and how the layers in a story are important. And so this is the thing about reading stories from like Assam. I feel like the way Aruni does the multi-layered nature of his narratives are very different from the way I do them.
Yeah.
And even if we are like discussing, like, for instance, like class divide in a story, I feel like the both of us do it very differently, because nothing is just a development issue, you know. And nothing is just anything, like everything is everything. And so that's why those layers become important and how they come together. And so there are cultural issues, there are some really unexpected, bizarre ideas and events that define certain incidents. And so I feel like that's the beauty of writing from these lesser known contexts, because they make available to us an idea of India that is not prevalent in the rest of the world. And so what Aruni brings out is like an idea of India that when I read, I feel like, oh, I really need to travel more around India. I haven't traveled enough and I haven't seen enough. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, obviously the difference in perspective also comes from its point of view, isn't it? Is what you can see. Because if you're from a different class, you have different struggles. So you see the world differently. And all of that informs, yes, you might talk about the same strata of society, but you're looking from here, one's looking from here, one's looking from here. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating. And that is why I'm also puzzled when people say they don't have stories to tell, because I think sometimes that's a failure of empathy. It's a failure of the ability to shift into another person's shoes or another reality in order to see that even the story that you told yesterday can be told again. Another way, which goes back to what Ingrid was saying. So I think this kind of, it brings it all together in what we do. What these prizes do is give greater visibility to people who have stories to tell, right? And ultimately, that's why I'm so pleased that you won last year, because I think your perspective and your voice is really compelling and important. And it's the same for Ingrid, who now has a novel. And I'm hoping that out of this shortlist this year, we'll get another great, winner. That is the joy for me of having been invited to judge the prize. And I now have an extra writer friend. We found we have a mutual friend, but so I think all of this is really wonderful. And I just hope that people, when you finally finish the novel, get to enjoy that, but also go out and read the rest of your work. It's lovely to catch up with you and hear what you're doing. And I hope that the next time we speak, we'll be speaking about your novel.